Okay, the last part of going over the skull is to just review the cranial fossa. The cranial fossae collectively are these indentations that are found on the interior of the skull. In lecture, I tried to talk a little bit about these, that the brain is going to rest in the side of the skull, and parts of the brain are going to be associated with each of these sort of indentations here. We break the cranial fossa into these three parts. The anterior cranial fossa here, the middle cranial fossa is this space here, and then the posterior cranial fossa is down here. When you look at this from the side, this will be the highest level. Then imagine taking a step down, and then this is kind of deeper still. Each of these has specific structures that delineate them, as well as specific things within those areas that are important to know. The good news is that you've already gone through most of that, so this will be a little bit of a review as we go through and talk about many of these structures. So notice that with the anterior cranial fossa here, you've got some structures that you're familiar with already, like the orbital plates of the frontal bone, forming these kind of bulges here, and just beneath that, of course, will be the orbit or the eye socket. You have the foramen cecum right here at the anterior end of this crista galli, that little shark-like bone, shark fin bone. The cribriform plate, this perforated bone on either side. And then as you come backwards to the boundary between the anterior cranial fossa and the posterior cranial fossa, you encounter the lesser wing of the sphenoid here and here. And then just to the medial side of that lesser wing is the optic foramen, there and there. And then you move into the middle cranial fossa. So the anterior cranial fossa ends here at the lesser wing, and is composed mostly of the frontal bone, but with a little bit of the sphenoid. All right, then we move into the middle cranial fossa. So the boundary here begins at the lesser wing of the sphenoid and ends here at the petrosal ridge. That's the ridge of the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So all this space in here is middle cranial fossa. This is where you're going to find the majority of the other foramen. So we already covered the optic foramen here. Here you can see the superior orbital fissure right there, and then you can see foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, and then foramen lacerum coming down through here. You can't see very well where a carotid canal would be, but it would be heading that way. Okay, and so one of the things you do need to be able to identify and learn is what passes through each of these various foramina. The other things that you can see in this middle cranial fossa is a couple of small grooves. Two of these grooves are for these nerves, the greater and lesser petrosal nerves that you'll learn about later on, and then a groove for the middle meningeal artery. I'm not sure this particular model shows those grooves super well. Let me just kind of see if I can hold them up in a way that these can be visualized. You can kind of see them here. So you can sort of see a little groove right there and another little groove running parallel to it. Those are the grooves for the greater and lesser petrosal nerves. Okay, those little grooves right there. The groove for the middle meningeal artery is harder to see on this one. So let me switch to this other skull. Let's see if it's a little better. It's so dark. You can kind of see it here. You can sort of see a groove running right along here. Okay, it comes from right there, which is the foramen spinosum, and it kind of curls up along the side right there. Okay, that's the groove for the middle meningeal artery. Middle meningeal artery comes from foramen spinosum. It emerges into the skull from there and then curls up along the side of the skull here, kind of running along the pterion portion of the skull, which is this kind of transparent area you see right there. You can see just how thin it really is. It's almost translucent. few other structures associated with the middle cranial fossa are like the arcuate eminence, which on this skull is this little bump right there. I don't know if you can see that very well or not. It's the arcuate eminence. If you dig through that bone right there, you'll find the superior semicircular canal, which is one of the 3 semicircular canals found in the inner ear vestibular system. So that's just found right underneath that arcuate eminence there. The trigeminal impression in the hypophyseal fossa, posterior clinoids. Okay, we've already covered hypophyseal fossa, posterior clinoids, the carotid canal, and so forth. But the trigeminal impression is a little impression like right here. You can sort of see a little indentation right there. Okay, that's the trigeminal impression. And the reason for this is that the trigeminal nerve has a large ganglion, and that ganglion sits right in that indentation. And then the 3 parts of the trigeminal nerve, V1, which is the ophthalmic branch, it will pass up through here through the supraorbital fissure. V2, which is the maxillary branch, will go through foramen rotundum, and V3, which is the mandibular branch of the trigeminal, will go through here through foramen ovale. So the nerve itself emerges from the pons of the brain, comes up over here, the ganglion sits right there, and then it splits into its 3 parts, V1, ophthalmic, V2, maxillary, and V3, mandibular. All right, and then we finally move into the posterior cranial fossa here. So that begins at the petrosal ridge and comes clear back to the back here. And associated with that, you have the jugular foramen, the internal auditory meatus, technically the hypophyseal canals or hypophyseal fossas here. And then these deep indentations where the cerebellum will sit, including a kind of prominent bump right there, which is the internal occipital protuberance and crest. Okay, these little ridges here. And that pretty much covers the posterior cranial fossa and the cranial fossa in general. And that takes care of all the stuff you need to know for the bones of the skull.